The year was 1893, and by the time autumn settled over the Blue Ridge Mountains, hardly anyone beyond the neighboring hollows remembered the Hollister family. Their cabin stood at the edge of Black Briar Hollow, where the mountains seemed to swallow the sunlight long before evening and the forest whispered with every passing wind. Travelers avoided the narrow trail leading into the valley, claiming the woods had a habit of changing direction after sunset, but the Hollisters paid little attention to such stories. Thomas Hollister had never been a superstitious man. At 42 years old, his hands were rough from years of cutting timber, building fences, and farming Rocky Mountain soil that never gave more than it had to. His wife, Eleanor, possessed a quiet strength that balanced Thomas's stubbornness. Together they raised 3 children, 15-year-old Samuel, 12-year-old Ruth, and little Benjamin, who had only recently celebrated his 7th birthday. They lived simply, owning little beyond their cabin: a smokehouse, a small barn, 2 mules, several chickens, and enough land to survive another hard winter. To outsiders, there seemed an ordinary Appalachian family, but the mountains have a way of hiding extraordinary sorrow beneath ordinary lives. It began on a cold September morning when Samuel discovered strange footprints circling the family's cornfield. They were unlike any tracks he had ever seen while hunting deer or following black bears through the ridges. The prints resembled bare human feet, yet each one stretched unnaturally long, with toes far too thin to belong to any man. Even stranger, they formed a perfect circle around the corn without ever entering it. Thomas dismissed them as the work of pranksters from the neighboring settlement, though no one lived within 5 miles of Black Briar Hollow. He grabbed a shovel and erased every mark before breakfast, telling Samuel there was no sense worrying his mother over childish nonsense. Eleanor said nothing, but she noticed how the chickens refused to leave the coop that morning despite the open door. Animals often sense danger before people ever did. 3 nights later, Benjamin awoke screaming. He insisted someone had been standing outside his bedroom window. Thomas rushed outside, carrying his old rifle, expecting to frighten away a prowler, but found nothing except mist drifting through the trees. There were no footprints beneath the window despite the damp earth, no broken branches, no sign anyone had approached the cabin. Benjamin refused to sleep alone afterward, insisting the visitor had no eyes, only smooth pale skin where a face should have been. Eleanor comforted the frightened boy, assuming he had suffered a nightmare brought on by the strange mountain tales older children often whispered around campfires. Yet she secretly nailed a small wooden cross above each bedroom window before dawn. October arrived with relentless rain. Streams overflowed their banks, washing away sections of the narrow wagon road leading toward the nearest church. Isolation was nothing new for mountain families, but this year felt different. Even the birds disappeared. Normally, crows gathered along the ridges every morning, filling the valleys with harsh cries. Yet now the forest remained unnaturally silent. Thomas mentioned it only once before shrugging the thought away. The mountains always had quiet seasons, he reasoned. Samuel wasn't convinced. While checking trap lines along the creek, he found several rabbits already dead inside untouched traps. None had visible injuries. Their bodies appeared healthy except for one disturbing detail. Every rabbit's eyes had turned completely white. Samuel buried them beneath loose stones without bringing any home. He told his father what he had seen, expecting concern, but Thomas merely blamed disease. "The woods ain't cursed," he muttered. "They're just harder than people." A week later, Reverend Isaac Morgan finally reached Black Briar Hollow after missing 2 consecutive Sunday services due to washed-out roads. He carried a leather Bible worn smooth from decades of preaching through isolated settlements. After supper, he lingered longer than usual, repeatedly glancing toward the tree line behind the cabin. Thomas eventually laughed and asked whether the preacher expected wolves. Reverend Morgan hesitated before answering. "Have you folk heard anyone calling your names after dark?" The question silenced the room. Eleanor slowly lowered her teacup. Samuel looked toward Benjamin, whose frightened expression immediately returned. Thomas frowned. "No, The Reverend nodded, but seemed unconvinced. He explained another family, nearly 20 miles north, claimed someone had been calling each member outside at night, using voices identical to loved ones. The father disappeared after following what he believed was his wife's voice into the woods. His body was never found. Thomas dismissed the account as another mountain legend exaggerated by fear. Reverend Morgan didn't argue. Before leaving, however, he quietly handed Eleanor a small silver cross and whispered, "If anyone calls from outside after sunset, make certain you see their face before opening your door." She never forgot those words. Days later, the first snow arrived far earlier than expected. Thin flakes drifted across the mountains while leaves still clung to oak branches, creating an unsettling contrast of autumn and winter. That evening, Ruth noticed someone standing beside the old apple tree behind the barn. She mentioned it casually during supper, believing a traveler might have wandered onto their property. Thomas stepped outside with his lantern. Again, no one was there. Yet beneath the apple tree, he found every fallen apple arranged into a perfect spiral stretching nearly 20 feet across the frozen ground. He stared at the pattern without speaking. He had never seen anything like it. Returning inside, he told his family only that deer must have disturbed the fruit. Samuel recognized the lie immediately. His father had never lied about the woods before. Over the following week, small things began disappearing. First, it was Eleanor's sewing scissors. Then Samuel's hunting knife vanished from the workbench. Benjamin's carved wooden horse disappeared from beside his bed despite every window remaining locked. None of the missing items were valuable, yet each absence unsettled the family more than outright theft would have. It felt less like robbery and more like someone testing whether they noticed. One evening, Eleanor discovered muddy footprints across the cabin floor leading from the front door to Benjamin's room. The strange part wasn't the tracks themselves. It was that the front door remained bolted from inside, untouched since sunset. Thomas searched every inch of the cabin with rifle in hand, but found no intruder. The footprints simply ended beside Benjamin's bed. That night, no one slept. The next morning, Thomas decided to visit old Elijah Boone, an 80-year-old trapper who had lived deeper in the mountains longer than anyone could remember. Elijah rarely spoke more than necessary, but people respected his knowledge of forgotten trails and older stories passed down before the Civil War. After hearing Thomas describe the footprints, disappearing belongings, and mysterious voices, the old man remained silent for nearly a minute. Finally, he asked one question. "Did you ever cut a tree with 3 lightning scars running down its trunk?" Thomas froze. Earlier that summer, he had indeed felled an enormous chestnut tree marked by 3 black streaks. Its timber had built the family's new smokehouse. Elijah's weathered face lost what little color remained. "That weren't no ordinary tree," he whispered. "My grandfather warned me never touch it. Folks called it the Sentinel because something older than memory slept beneath its roots." Thomas scoffed despite the chill creeping through his body. Elijah wasn't offended. Instead, he retrieved a faded journal wrapped carefully in cloth. Inside were handwritten accounts dating back to the early 1800s describing families who disappeared after disturbing sacred places deep within the mountains. Livestock wandered home covered in blood that wasn't their own. Entire cabins were found intact with meals still warm on tables, but no trace of the people living there. Each account mentioned impossible footprints, voices in the dark, and circles carved into the earth. "You still got time," Elijah finally said. "Put back what was taken. Leave the mountain alone." Thomas returned home convinced the old man had surrendered to age and superstition, yet he couldn't shake the growing unease inside him. That evening, he walked alone to the stump where the chestnut tree had once stood. Snow covered everything except one perfect ring of bare earth surrounding the old roots. Standing at its center was Benjamin's missing wooden horse, freshly carved despite having vanished weeks earlier. Thomas slowly picked it up. The wood felt warm, as though someone had only moments before finished carving it. Then, from somewhere deep among the silent trees, he heard Eleanor calling his name. Her voice sounded frightened, desperate, pleading for help. He ran toward the sound without thinking. Branches whipped against it. Thomas's breath hung like smoke in the frozen air as he slowly turned toward the voice behind him. But there was no Eleanor waiting in the darkness, no frightened wife calling for help, only an endless wall of towering pines standing motionless beneath a sky that had become strangely colorless. Every instinct screamed for him to run, yet his boots refused to move as the impossible footprints surrounding him seemed to multiply with every passing second. They circled him in widening rings, each print pressed deeply into the snow, although no figure could be seen making them. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the forest erupted with sound. Crows burst from the treetops in a black cloud, their frantic cries shattering the unnatural silence. Thomas stumbled backward, clutching Benjamin's carved wooden horse against his chest before turning toward home with all the strength he had left. He crashed through briars and low branches, no longer caring about the trail, guided only by the faint glow of the cabin lantern shining through the trees. When he finally reached the yard, Eleanor rushed from the porch with tears streaming down her face. Samuel stood behind her gripping the family rifle, while Ruth held Benjamin tightly against her side. "Where were you?" Eleanor cried. "You've been gone since yesterday morning." Thomas stared at her in disbelief. "Yesterday," he whispered. To him, only a few minutes had passed since he heard her voice in the woods. Samuel insisted the family had searched until nightfall, shouting his name through the hollow without receiving a single answer. The mules had become so terrified during the night that they nearly kicked apart the barn doors, while every dog belonging to distant neighbors had howled until sunrise. Thomas looked down at the wooden horse still clutched in his frozen hand. The fresh carving he had found beneath the old chestnut tree was now cracked with age, as though it had weathered years instead of hours. He said nothing that evening, choosing instead to sit beside the fire while staring into the flames. Long after the children fell asleep, he finally told Eleanor everything Elijah Boone had said about the sentinel tree and the voices that lured people into the mountains. She listened without interrupting, then quietly admitted she had hidden something from him. On the morning after the chestnut tree had been cut, she discovered a bundle of dried herbs tied with faded red thread hanging above their front door. Believing it to be the prank of passing hunters, she had thrown it into the fire without mentioning it. The next day, the family's misfortunes began. Before dawn, Thomas saddled the mules and returned to Elijah Boone's cabin, but smoke no longer rose from its chimney. The old trapper's door stood wide open, swaying gently in the wind. Inside, the cabin appeared untouched except for Elijah's journal lying open on the table beside an extinguished lantern. The old man himself had vanished without leaving a single sign of struggle. One unfinished sentence covered the final page in hurried handwriting. "If they answer in the voice of someone you love." The words stopped abruptly. The ink dragged across the paper as though the pen had been ripped from his hand. Thomas searched every corner of the property, but found only the same long, barefoot tracks disappearing into the trees. Fear finally replaced disbelief. He returned home, loaded every rifle, packed what supplies they could carry, and announced they would leave Black Briar Hollow before sunset. Eleanor did not argue. Samuel gathered blankets while Ruth filled sacks with dried beans and cornmeal. Benjamin silently carried his little wooden horse despite Eleanor's repeated requests to leave it behind. The family climbed into the wagon just as heavy gray clouds swallowed the afternoon sun. They had traveled less than a mile when both mules suddenly stopped. No amount of shouting or whipping could force them forward. Their ears flattened against their heads as they trembled violently. Thomas stepped down to investigate and discovered the narrow mountain road had disappeared. In its place stood an unbroken wall of dense forest where the trail had existed all his life. He spun around in confusion only to realize the cabin behind them had also vanished from sight, hidden by thick fog rolling silently through the valley. It was as if the mountain itself had rearranged its paths. Samuel pointed toward a distant ridge where dozens of pale figures seemed to stand between the trees. They were too far away to distinguish clearly, yet none of them moved. Benjamin whispered that they had been watching since morning. Thomas refused to let panic take control. He led the mules away from the wagon, hoping to find another route on foot, but after nearly an hour of climbing, they emerged into the exact same clearing where the wagon waited untouched. The mountains had become a prison. As darkness settled over Black Briar Hollow, the voices returned. At first they came one at a time, calling softly from different directions. Then dozens joined together. Some sounded like neighbors, others like relatives who had died years earlier. Eleanor heard her late mother's gentle voice asking her to come into the woods. Samuel heard the laughter of a childhood friend who had drowned in the river. Even Thomas heard his own father calling exactly as he had during hunting trips decades before. Only Ruth noticed something the others missed. None of the voices ever spoke to Benjamin. The little boy stood quietly beside the wagon, staring into the forest with an expression far older than his years. "They're waiting," he whispered. "They say the tree kept the door closed." Before anyone could ask what he meant, a deafening crack echoed across the hollow. High above them, the ancient stump of the sentinel tree split apart despite being months old. The earth surrounding it collapsed inward, revealing a dark cavity beneath the roots that seemed to breathe cold air into the night. From somewhere deep below came the slow sound of footsteps climbing upward, one deliberate step after another, as every lantern flame around the Hollister family flickered blue and the mountain fell silent once again.